Maya, a young black intern, is sitting cross-legged on an expensive Persian rug, completely covered in crayon dust. Right next to her are Leo and Lucas, two extremely mischievous 3-year-old boys who have already sent 4 professional nannies packing in tears. Absolutely nobody could manage these little hurricanes. But right now, they are completely mesmerized as Maya draws a family of tiger pups on a scrap piece of paper. Hey there, folks, I'm Sam, and welcome back to Tale and Tale. Those 2 boys belong to Alexander, the strict, single-dad CEO of a major tech firm. As he watched them from behind the glass office doors, seeing their daily chaos turn into quiet wonder, he realized his entire, carefully structured world was about to change. It's a beautiful story about finding true connection and presence in the cold, corporate hustle. Before we dive into the rest of this amazing journey, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Drop your city in the comments below and make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story. The wind coming off Lake Michigan on a Monday morning in late October didn't just blow, it bit. It carried a damp, relentless chill that swept through the concrete canyons of downtown Chicago, turning the morning sky the color of bruised iron. The wind rattled the street lamps and sent stray newspapers tumbling down the sidewalks, but high above the grey, biting streets, enclosed in a fortress of reinforced glass and soundproof steel, sat the headquarters of Sterling Innovations. I'm Sam, and let me tell you, if you live long enough, you learn that there are days that break you with a whisper and days that break you with a scream. This particular Monday on the executive floor started with a deafening scream. Alexander Sterling, the 35-year-old chief executive officer, stood frozen in the dead center of his sprawling glass-walled office. If you looked at Alexander on a magazine cover, you would see perfection. He was tall, imposing, with a sharp jawline that looked like it had been carved from the very marble that lined his corporate lobby. His eyes were a pale, Arctic blue, usually fixed in a dead-level stare that could effortlessly freeze a board of directors mid-sentence. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, the kind of aggressive, flawless tailoring that costs more than a decent used car, fitting his broad shoulders so perfectly it looked like armor. Alexander was a man entirely defined by his control. He commanded a small army of brilliant tech developers and elite designers with absolute, unyielding rigidity. But this coldness wasn't born with him. It was a callus formed over a wound that never healed. 3 years ago, his wife Elena passed away shortly after childbirth. When she took her last breath, the warmth in Alexander died with her. Terrified of the agonizing void she left behind, he buried his grief under mountains of spreadsheets, quarterly earnings, and 100-hour work weeks. Work was the one thing that never abandoned him, the one thing he could measure, control, and manage. But you cannot manage a storm, and currently Alexander was trapped in a room with 2 of them. Leo and Lucas, his 3-year-old twin sons, were locked in a state of pure, unfiltered hysteria. They were identical, boasting mops of unruly dark curls and their late mother's huge, expressive hazel eyes. Yet their personalities were pure, unadulterated chaos. Dressed in miniature, expensive navy sweaters that were now smeared with sticky remnants of a violently rejected breakfast, they were not just stubborn children, they were a force of nature. They were currently rolling on the floor, thrashing against the incredibly expensive, hand-woven Persian rug, kicking their little legs and shrieking in a high-pitched, synchronized wailing that physically vibrated against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Standing near the heavy oak door, trembling with a mixture of profound rage and sheer, tearful exhaustion, was Sarah. Sarah was their nanny. She was a woman in her late 50s who usually possessed a grandmotherly softness. Plump, grey-haired, and wearing sensible orthotic shoes, she had spent 20 years as a pediatric nurse. She was a woman who prided herself on having the patience of an absolute saint, but the Sterling twins had broken her. She was the fourth nanny Alexander had hired in exactly 2 months. Her face was flushed a deep, dangerous red, and her usually immaculate bun was unraveling down her neck. As she tried to step forward, a heavy plastic toy fire truck flew across the room, launched by Lucas, missing her knee by a fraction of an inch and smashing into the mahogany baseboard. That was the breaking point. The saint retired. Without uttering a single word, Sarah dug into the pocket of her sensible beige cardigan, pulled out the heavy brass keycard that granted access to the executive suite, and dropped it. The metallic clatter against the hardwood floor sounded like a gunshot in the tense air. She turned on her heel, stepped backward into the private elevator, and let the brushed steel doors slide shut, not looking back at Alexander even once. Alexander stood entirely helpless. The great CEO, the man who had effortlessly orchestrated a $50 million tech merger just 2 weeks prior without blinking, felt completely paralyzed. He looked down at the Persian rug, now a chaotic battleground. All his towering intelligence, his expensive leadership seminars, his absolute command over hundreds of elite personnel, it meant absolutely nothing in the face of 2 weeping, thrashing toddlers. He rubbed his temples, feeling a severe migraine pulsing behind his eyes, a painful reminder that his professional power ended the moment fatherhood began. Meanwhile, 3 floors down in the creative department, a completely different kind of disaster was unfolding. The air down here didn't smell like panic. It smelled like burnt espresso, laser printer ozone, and crushed dreams. Here stood Maya Washington. She was 23 years old, a young black woman with skin the rich, deep color of polished mahogany. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight, practical cluster of braids that kept it out of her face when she was bent over a drafting table. She wore a thrifted olive-green blazer that was slightly frayed at the cuffs, a quiet betrayal of her desperately empty bank account, but she had ironed it so perfectly that it demanded respect. Maya had grown up in the rougher neighborhoods of the South Side, taking 3 different buses every morning just to attend a high school that had an underfunded, crumbling art program. She was poor, practically living off instant noodles, but her spirit was spun from industrial steel. Her hands were her greatest asset, long-fingered and always carrying faint, indelible smudges of graphite and digital ink. She poured her entire vibrant soul into her designs, believing with everything in her that art had to speak directly to the human heart. But the human heart had absolutely no place in the office she was currently standing in. Maya was standing in front of the sleek, minimalist glass desk of Richard, the department's creative director. Richard was a man in his mid-40s who wore aggressive, geometric, thick-rimmed glasses and possessed a condescending sneer so permanent it seemed surgically attached to his thin face. He was tall, gaunt, dressed in avant-garde black designer clothing, and harbored a deep, toxic resentment for anyone who possessed raw, natural talent, likely because his own creative well had dried up a decade ago. Maya's heart was pounding violently against her ribs. She was biting her lower lip so hard she could taste the faint, metallic tang of copper. She had just placed a printed draft on his desk, a logo and brand identity she had stayed up 3 nights to perfect for a massive new corporate campaign. It was warm, it was inviting, and it told a story of human connection through subtle, sweeping, colorful lines. It was a piece of her soul. Richard picked up the heavy cardstock with 2 fingers, looking at it as if he were holding a dead, diseased insect. He let it drop back onto the glass surface with a dismissive smack. "Too much emotion, Maya," Richard drawled, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "Our clients do not want a bedtime story. They want modern, they want edgy. Do they want sharp angles and aggressive market positioning? Not this tear-jerker, sentimental nonsense. He didn't even bother to look up at her face as he waved a manicured, dismissive hand toward the door. Faccio toi mot li americano chargi. Make me an iced Americano. That is what you are actually here to do, isn't it? Maya felt the agonizing sting behind her eyes, the familiar hot prickle of tears threatening to spill over. But she didn't let them fall. She couldn't afford to. She desperately needed this internship. She was exactly 3 weeks away from earning the certification that would allow her to finally step out of the shadows, leave Richard's tyranny behind, and apply for a real, salaried position. She slowly reached out and picked up her rejected sketchbook, her knuckles turning ash-grey from how tightly she gripped the leather cover. She swallowed the lump in her throat, nodded silently, and turned away. She walked down the long, sterile hallway to the departmental break room. With practiced, mechanical precision, she began to pull the espresso shots, carefully measuring the ice, calculating the ratio to make the drink absolutely perfect. It was a deeply humiliating ritual, a daily reminder of her place at the very bottom of the corporate food chain. She swallowed her pride, pushing down her frustration with every drop of dark, bitter coffee that fell into the plastic cup. As she stood there, in the quiet, sterile silence of the break room, staring blankly at the coffee machine, a sudden, sharp noise echoed from above. Thwack, thwack, crash. Through the industrial exposed ceiling of the 3rd floor, Maya looked up. She could hear the distinct, heavy sound of plastic toy cars being hurled violently against the reinforced glass. It was coming directly from the CEO's office right above her. She didn't know it yet, but the chaos at the very top of the building was about to collide with the quiet heartbreak at the bottom. By the time noon rolled around, the biting chill outside had done nothing to cool the simmering tensions inside Sterling Innovations. Down on the 3rd floor, Maya Washington was still trying to swallow the bitter pill of her morning rejection. She was standing by the industrial printers when Brenda approached her. Brenda was the departmental floor manager, a woman in her late 40s who ran the creative floor with the militant precision of a seasoned drill sergeant. She was a tall, rail-thin woman who always wore severe, monochromatic pantsuits that matched her completely transactional personality. Brenda had survived 2 grueling decades in corporate middle management by adopting a philosophy that banned small talk and treated interns as little more than sentient delivery mechanisms. She thrust a thick, red-tabbed manila folder into Maya's hands. "Confidential client briefs," Brenda snapped, her voice carrying the dry rasp of someone who drank too much black tea and never slept enough. "The CEO needs this immediately for the afternoon teleconference. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't linger. Just drop it on his desk and vanish. And take this up with you," she added, handing Maya a fresh, perfectly iced Americano, presumably meant for some executive assistant. Maya simply nodded, clutching the heavy folder to her chest along with her worn canvas bag, and made her way to the private executive elevator. As the brushed steel box ascended silently toward the glass penthouse, Maya took a deep, steadying breath. She had never been to the top floor. Rumor had it that Alexander Sterling ran his suite like a sterile, silent monastery where a dropped pen sounded like a bomb. She expected to walk into an atmosphere of chilling, corporate perfection. The elevator chimed, the heavy doors slid open, and Maya stepped directly into what could only be described as an active war zone. The sterile sanctuary of the CEO was completely decimated. Alexander Sterling, the immaculate titan of industry who usually looked like he had been sculpted from ice, was currently losing his mind. His bespoke charcoal suit jacket was discarded on a leather chair, his expensive silk tie was yanked loose, and his pristine white dress shirt was severely wrinkled, bearing a suspicious sticky handprint near the hem. He was desperately attempting to pry Lucas away from a massive, ornate porcelain pot situated in the corner of the room. Inside the pot was a rare, white Phalaenopsis orchid, a commemorative gift from the board, and one of the few living things Alexander actually tolerated in his office. Lucas, his face red with exertion, was methodically and violently plucking the delicate white petals off the stems, tossing them onto the floor like morbid confetti. On the opposite side of the expansive room, Leo was putting on a theatrical display of absolute misery. He was lying flat on his back on the $1,000,000 Persian rug, kicking his heels rhythmically into the floorboards while screaming at a pitch that threatened to shatter the floor-to-ceiling windows. The source of his profound agony was a small crystal candy dish sitting securely on the highest shelf of Alexander's bookcase, completely out of reach. The room was a cacophony of shrieks, the tearing of foliage, and the heavy, exhausted sighs of a father who was completely out of his depth. Most of the executive secretaries and junior assistants who usually hovered around this floor had completely vanished, having smartly evacuated the blast radius. Any normal intern would have awkwardly dropped the confidential folder on the nearest surface and sprinted back to the safety of the elevator. Maya did not run. She stood frozen for a mere second, observing the sheer desperation etched into the powerful CEO's face. And then she moved. She didn't announce her presence. She didn't offer a platitude or try to raise her voice over the deafening wails of the toddlers. She simply walked past the massive mahogany desk, gently placed the confidential file and the iced Americano on the polished wood, and let out a quiet sigh. Then she did the unthinkable. Right there, in the middle of the most intimidating office in Chicago, Maya dropped her heavy canvas bag onto the floor. She ignored the fact that she was wearing a professional, albeit thrifted, olive green skirt. She folded her legs and sat directly on the Persian rug, right in the epicenter of the chaos. She unzipped her worn bag and pulled out a large, battered, spiral-bound sketchbook. Its pages were thick and slightly yellowed at the edges. Next, she produced a tin box. It wasn't a set of professional markers or expensive digital styluses. It was just a simple, dented metal box of thick, chunky wax crayons. She didn't try to coax the boys. She didn't issue a command or try to negotiate a peace treaty. Maya simply opened her sketchbook to a massive blank white page, selected a vibrant sunset orange crayon, and began to draw. Her hand moved with a fluid, practiced grace. The wax scraped softly against the heavy paper, a rhythmic, grounding sound beneath the layer of screaming. She drew bold, sweeping lines, pressing hard to leave thick, waxy deposits of color. "You know," Maya murmured. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a rich, warm, and deeply resonant cadence. It was the kind of voice that naturally commanded attention without demanding it. Deep inside the great pine forest, where the trees are so tall they tickle the clouds, there were two little tiger pups who had lost their way. She picked up a black crayon, swiftly adding sharp, dynamic stripes to the orange shapes she had formed. They were very brave, but they were very grumpy because they couldn't find their bright, magnificent tails. The cadence of her storytelling matched the rhythm of her drawing. It wasn't just a distraction, it was an invitation into a different world. The magic of it was almost instantaneous. Leo's rhythmic kicking began to slow, the high-pitched wail hitched in his throat, dissolving into a wet hiccup. He rolled over onto his stomach, his tear-streaked face resting on the carpet, his large hazel eyes locking on to the bright orange shapes blooming on the paper. Across the room, Lucas paused mid-pluck. A single white orchid petal fluttered from his tiny fingers to the floor. The sound of Maya's calm, steady voice detailing the adventure of the lost tiger pups cut through his tantrum like a beacon. Slowly, almost as if pulled by an invisible string, Lucas abandoned the ravaged plant. He took one hesitant step toward the center of the room, then another. Leo pushed himself up on his hands and knees, crawling over the expensive rug until he was sitting right beside Maya's knee. Lucas joined him a second later, plopping down on her other side. Maya didn't stop drawing, nor did she acknowledge their sudden proximity with any big gestures. She simply kept detailing the pine forest, the dark green needles, the shadows of the woods. The boys were completely mesmerized. The office, which just moments ago had felt like the inside of a jet engine, was now incredibly, profoundly quiet. The only sounds were the soft scraping of wax on paper and the sniffles of two exhausted toddlers. After a long minute, Leo hesitantly reached out a small, slightly sticky hand toward the open tin box. He looked up at Maya, a silent question in his wide eyes. Maya smiled, a genuine warm expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes, and gently pushed the box closer to him. Lucas immediately grabbed a blue crayon, his tears forgotten, completely absorbed in the world of the tiger pups. Alexander Sterling stood absolutely petrified behind his mahogany desk. He had completely forgotten about the confidential file, the impending teleconference, and the ruined orchid. His breath caught in his throat. He watched as his two sons, the little hurricanes who had broken seasoned professionals, sat peacefully, coloring alongside a 23-year-old intern he barely recognized. Maya's olive-green blazer contrasted sharply with the boys' expensive navy sweaters, yet they looked entirely harmonious, a quiet oasis in the middle of his corporate fortress. Alexander felt a strange, sudden ache in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in 3 long years. His heart physically skipped a beat. It wasn't the adrenaline of a boardroom victory or the sharp sting of his perpetual grief. It was something entirely different. He was watching a stranger effortlessly provide the one thing his wealth, his power, and his intellect had completely failed to give his children. A moment of genuine, uncomplicated peace. The exact same afternoon, the atmosphere on the executive floor had shifted from a Category 5 hurricane to a tense, fragile quiet. Alexander Sterling sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his posture rigidly straight, though the deep exhaustion in his pale blue eyes betrayed him. Standing at polite attention beside the door was a newly summoned presence, Elias Vance. Elias was a man who looked as though he had been rigorously ironed along with his meticulously tailored charcoal suits. At 45, with razor-sharp, prematurely silver hair, and a demeanor so rigidly professional it bordered on the robotic, he was Alexander's chief executive assistant and the undisputed gatekeeper of the penthouse. Elias possessed the warmth of a spreadsheet, having survived 10 years under Alexander's demanding leadership by anticipating problems before they even materialized. Today, however, Elias looked entirely out of his depth as he held a freshly drafted addendum to an internship contract, glancing nervously at the 2 exhausted toddlers sleeping soundly on the leather sofa. Sitting across from Alexander, holding her battered canvas bag on her lap, was Maya Washington. She had been summoned upstairs exactly 20 minutes after the boys had finally cried themselves to sleep, expecting to be formally reprimanded for abandoning her post or perhaps fired for overstepping corporate boundaries. Instead, the icy CEO had slid a piece of heavy cardstock across the desk toward her. Alexander cleared his throat, adjusting his cuffs in an attempt to regain a fraction of his usual commanding presence. "Miss Washington, what you managed to do earlier today was highly unusual," he began, his voice maintaining its customary low, authoritative rumble, though it lacked its usual sharp edge. "I have gone through 4 highly trained childcare professionals in 8 weeks. None of them could de-escalate a situation like that. I am a man who values efficiency and results. Therefore, I am prepared to offer you an addendum to your current internship. I will triple your current weekly stipend, effective immediately. In exchange, I want you to relocate your workspace to this office every afternoon, after the boys return from their morning preschool program. Your primary responsibility will be to manage them, keep them quiet, and prevent them from dismantling this floor while I conduct my afternoon meetings." Elias gave a crisp, supportive nod from the doorway, clearly expecting the young, visibly underpaid intern to eagerly snatch the lucrative lifeline. Maya looked down at the contract, then up at the multimillionaire CEO. The financial offer was staggering. It was enough to completely pay off her mounting student debts and fix the broken heating unit in her cramped South Side apartment. But as she looked at Alexander, she didn't see a generous benefactor. She saw a man trying to buy a silencer for his children. Maya took a slow, deep breath, her dark eyes meeting his piercing blue ones without a single flinch. A soft, steadfast smile touched her lips, but her gaze was absolute iron. "Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, I am a graphic designer, not a nanny," Maya said, her voice warm but unwavering, echoing clearly in the vast, silent room. "I appreciate the financial offer more than you know, but if I accept this, I will not be managing your children. Children aren't corporate assets to be managed or silenced. I will agree to come up here, but only on the condition that we share this space. I need to do my actual work, and they need a place to do theirs. I will give them a creative space, and they will be allowed to express themselves freely. No forced, quiet time, no strict rules about staying inside the lines. If you want a warden, you should hire your 5th nanny. If you want my help, it happens on my terms. We share the space, and we create." Alexander stared at her, genuinely stunned. In the cutthroat halls of Sterling Innovations, absolutely no one dictated terms to him, let alone a 23-year-old intern wearing a frayed thrift store blazer. He looked over at Leo and Lucas, their small chests rising and falling peacefully, their faces still carrying the faint smudges of orange crayon. For the first time in his professional life, Alexander Sterling surrendered. He gave a slow, curt nod, gesturing for Elias to amend the paperwork. Within 48 hours, a strange and deeply unprecedented symbiosis took hold of the penthouse suite. The far right corner of the sleek, minimalist executive office, formerly a barren expanse of expensive hardwood and cold glass, had been completely transformed into an accidental art studio. A large, thick, vinyl dropcloth was spread over a section of the Persian rug to protect it from collateral damage. 2 child-sized wooden easels stood proudly next to a low, sprawling coffee table completely covered in tubs of non-toxic finger paints, watercolor palettes, and endless stacks of recycled printer paper. Maya set up her modest, sticker-covered laptop on a small side table right in the thick of the artistic chaos. Every afternoon at 1 o'clock the twins would storm through the heavy oak doors, completely ignoring their father's imposing desk, and make a direct, enthusiastic beeline for Maya's corner. It was a bizarre, beautiful juxtaposition. On one side of the room, Alexander orchestrated massive tech acquisitions, his voice a low, commanding baritone, discussing profit margins and market shares. On the other side, Maya sat cross-legged on a beanbag chair, digitally rendering vector graphics, while Leo passionately explained why his painting of a dog needed 6 bright purple legs. Maya completely ignored the traditional rules of childcare. She let them draw outside the margins. She let them mix all the primary colours until they created a muddy, joyful brown. She never corrected their chaotic scribbles. She simply provided the tools and the safety to let them exist. This environment of absolute, unjudged freedom began to work a quiet miracle, not just on the unruly children, but on Maya herself. The harsh, biting rejection she had suffered at the hands of the creative director, Richard, had initially left her feeling entirely creatively blocked. But sitting here, surrounded by the raw, unfiltered emotional expression of two toddlers, the heavy corporate walls in her mind began to crack. She watched Lucas aggressively swirl yellow and red paint together, purely for the joy of seeing the colours collide, completely unconcerned with the final product or market expectations. Maya realized that this was exactly what her corporate branding project was missing. Richard wanted sharp, sterile angles and aggressive, emotionless positioning. But Maya secretly opened a new file on her laptop and began to rebuild the rejected campaign from scratch. She incorporated the fluid, sweeping energy of the children's brushstrokes. She used warm, inviting color palettes inspired by their chaotic finger paintings. She was designing a brand identity that didn't yell at the consumer to buy a product, but rather invited them to be part of a human story. She worked in absolute secrecy, channeling the bright, messy heartbeat of the accidental art studio into a sleek, professional masterpiece, driven by the profound realization that true connection couldn't be engineered. It had to be felt. It was during one of these vibrant, late-afternoon sessions that Alexander experienced a paradigm shift that would permanently alter the trajectory of his life. He had just finished a grueling 2-hour teleconference and was silently observing the art corner over the top of his silver laptop screen. Lucas, standing at his wooden easel, was attempting to paint a massive, radiant yellow sun. In his eager excitement, the 3-year-old's elbow violently clipped a large, open bottle of Black India ink Maya was using for her calligraphy sketches. Time seemed to slow down. The heavy glass bottle tipped, spilling a thick, inky black puddle directly across Lucas's bright yellow masterpiece, ruining it instantly. Alexander instantly braced himself for the inevitable explosion. He recognized the look on Lucas's face, the wide, terrified eyes, the quivering lower lip, the sudden, sharp intake of breath that always preceded a deafening, earth-shattering tantrum. Alexander's immediate instinct, honed by years of cutthroat corporate management, was to march over, scold the boy for his clumsiness, point out the ruined work, and order the mess to be cleaned up. It was the exact same way he handled his employees when they made a costly error. But Maya moved first. She didn't gasp, she didn't scold, and she didn't rush to grab paper towels in a frantic panic. She simply slid across the floor, picked up a thick, damp paintbrush, and knelt right beside the trembling toddler. "Oh, wow, Lucas, look at that," Maya said, her voice echoing with genuine, unfeigned wonder. "I thought we were just painting a sunny day, but you brought the magic. That's not a mistake. That is a magnificent rolling storm cloud. Look how powerful it is." She guided Lucas's small, ink-stained hand, helping him use the brush to swirl the stark black ink into the wet yellow paint, creating a beautiful, textured, moody sky. "Now should we add some lightning?" she asked. Lucas's quivering lip instantly stilled. The tears that had pooled in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sudden, fierce spark of creativity. He nodded vigorously, grabbing a yellow crayon to strike lightning bolts through his new storm. Sitting safely behind his imposing desk, Alexander felt as though all the air had been violently punched out of his lungs. He stared at the ruined painting that had just been transformed into a masterpiece, and a profound, crushing realization washed over him. He thought about the junior software developer he had mercilessly fired last month for a coding error instead of guiding him through the fix. He thought about how he always yelled at Leo when the boy spilled his juice at the breakfast table, demanding perfection from a grieving 3-year-old. Alexander had spent his entire life punishing mistakes, viewing them as fatal flaws to be eradicated and penalized. He demanded flawless results from his staff and his sons, creating an atmosphere of perpetual fear. But watching Maya calmly turn a disastrous spill into a beautiful storm cloud, he saw the glaring, ugly flaw in his own worldview. He realized, with a heavy, aching heart, that his rigid pursuit of perfection was exactly what had been breaking his children and alienating his employees. In that quiet, paint-splattered corner of his empire, the great CEO finally understood that true leadership and true fatherhood wasn't about preventing the ink from spilling. It was about having the grace to help turn the stain into something beautiful. The imposing, sterile silence that had long defined the executive penthouse was slowly, irrevocably dissolving. Over the next 2 weeks, Maya's quiet presence acted as a gentle solvent, melting away the rigid, suffocating boundaries Alexander Sterling had constructed around his life and his company. The air on the top floor no longer felt like the inside of a vacuum-sealed vault. Instead, it carried the faint, nostalgic scent of wax crayons, lavender baby wipes, and the occasional burst of uninhibited toddler giggles. This shifting paradigm was acutely observed by Julian Hayes, the newly appointed Vice President of Finance, who walked into the CEO's office late one Friday afternoon. Julian was 32, a man composed entirely of nervous energy and caffeine, identifiable by his slicked-back blonde hair and the expensive smartwatch he compulsively checked every 3 minutes. He lived his life in fiscal quarters and margin projections, terrified of Alexander's legendary wrath. When Julian pushed open the heavy oak doors, expecting a brutal interrogation regarding the Q3 budget deficits, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, in the center of the room, was a scene that completely defied corporate logic. Maya was sitting comfortably on her beanbag chair, reviewing color swatches on her laptop, while Leo and Lucas were aggressively coloring a massive sheet of butcher paper unrolled across the expensive Persian rug. Julian quietly left the budget reports on the edge of the desk and retreated, sensing he had walked into a sacred space. As the heavy doors clicked shut, Maya looked up from her screen and glanced over at the towering CEO. Alexander was standing near the window, reviewing a contract, looking as imposing and untouchable as ever in his tailored suit. But the harsh lines around his eyes had visibly softened. Maya reached into the dented tin box, pulled out a stubby moss-green crayon, and stood up. She walked over to the window and gently pressed the crayon directly into Alexander's large, calloused hand. He blinked, looking down at the small piece of wax as if she had just handed him a live grenade. "Sit down, boss," Maya said, a playful, challenging glint in her dark eyes. "Leo says this landscape is entirely unacceptable. It's completely barren. He insists the picture needs a tree, and he specifically requested that you be the one to plant it." Alexander looked from Maya to the 2 toddlers, who had paused their frantic scribbling to stare up at him with wide, expectant hazel eyes. A heavy, unfamiliar silence stretched between them. For a terrifying second, Maya wondered if she had finally overstepped the invisible line. But then Alexander slowly reached up and loosened his expensive silk tie. He unfastened his cufflinks, rolled his crisp white sleeves up to his forearms, and let out a long, defeated exhale. Moving with the stiff, awkward grace of a man who hadn't sat on a floor in decades, the powerful CEO lowered himself onto the carpet. He crossed his long legs, leaned over the butcher paper, and gripped the green crayon like a surgical scalpel. With intense, furrowed concentration, Alexander drew a tree. It was, without a doubt, the most rigidly corporate tree ever committed to paper. It consisted of one perfectly straight vertical line for a trunk and a perfectly symmetrical, ruler-straight triangle for the leaves. It looked less like a living piece of nature and more like a geometric data chart indicating upward market growth. Maya stared at it for a second, her lips twitching. Then a soft snort escaped her. Leo pointed a chubby, paint-stained finger at the aggressive triangle and let out a high-pitched, genuine squeal of laughter. Lucas immediately joined in, falling onto his back and giggling uncontrollably at his father's terrible artwork. Alexander looked at his stiff, ridiculous drawing, then at Maya, who was now laughing so hard she had to cover her mouth. Slowly, a deep, rumbling sound began to build in Alexander's chest. It was a rusty, unfamiliar sound that cracked through his icy exterior. He threw his head back and laughed. It was a rich, booming sound that echoed off the glass walls, slipping into every dark, grieving corner of his heart, bringing light to places that had been dead for 3 years. But 3 floors down, in the ruthless trenches of the creative department, the warmth of the penthouse was completely absent. A dark storm was quietly brewing in the sterile corridors. Richard, the creative director, was pacing his office, desperately trying to salvage a massive upcoming pitch for the firm's largest client. His own ideas were stale, repetitive, and completely devoid of human connection. Prowling nearby was Chloe, his sycophantic junior assistant. Chloe was 26, aggressively ambitious, possessing sharp, blonde bobbed hair and an overpowering aura of heavy floral perfume. She utilized office gossip as currency and mimicked Richard's toxic condescension perfectly, hoping to claw her way up the corporate ladder by riding his coattails. While searching for a missing client brief, Richard had arrogantly logged into the department's shared cloud drive. Because Maya was only an intern, her digital workspace lacked secure encryption. Richard stumbled upon a hidden folder titled Tiger Pups, Brand Rebirth. Intrigued, he opened it. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. It was Maya's secret project, the brilliant, soul-stirring reimagining of the corporate identity inspired by her afternoons with the twins. It was fluid, emotional, and absolutely genius. It was everything Richard had failed to be for the past decade. Without a second of hesitation or a shred of moral conflict, Richard downloaded the entire directory. Working with Chloe behind closed doors, he began to systematically strip the soul out of Maya's work. He stole the brilliant core concepts, the sweeping lines, the interconnected narrative structure, but he callously butchered her warm color palettes, replacing them with cold, industrial grays and aggressive neon accents. He took her story of human connection and warped it into a hollow, soulless presentation about synergistic market dominance. Maya discovered the theft purely by accident late that afternoon. She had come downstairs to gather some specialized marker pens and overheard Chloe bragging loudly in the break room about Richard's sudden stroke of brilliant inspiration, showing another designer the new pitch deck on her phone. Maya froze in the doorway, her blood running ice cold. She recognized the foundation of the design immediately. It was her heart, her late nights, her quiet epiphanies, born from watching 2 toddlers paint a storm, now mangled and stamped with Richard's name. A profound, suffocating wave of exhaustion washed over her. She was 23, black, poor, and merely an intern. Richard was a wealthy, entrenched executive. If she spoke up, he would crush her. He would claim she stole from him, and the corporate machine would automatically protect the director over the expendable student. She felt entirely invisible, her voice too small to echo in these towering glass hallways. Heartbroken and feeling utterly defeated, Maya retreated to a quiet cubicle. Her fingers trembled violently over the keyboard as she quietly typed out a formal letter of resignation, citing unforeseen personal circumstances. She printed the single, devastating page, folded it neatly, and slipped it into her pocket, intending to leave it on Alexander's desk before she walked out of Sterling Innovations forever. That evening, long after the building had emptied and the city lights of Chicago began to blink through the darkness, Alexander remained in the penthouse. Maya had left hours ago, her departure unusually quiet and rushed. He was alone, kneeling by the accidental art studio, taking a strange, quiet comfort in organizing the scattered crayons and wiping down the paint-stained easels. As he lifted a stack of Leo's beloved Tiger Pup drawings to place them in a folder, a crisp, white piece of paper fluttered out and landed on the rug. Alexander picked it up, his brow furrowing as he unfolded it. It was Maya's resignation letter, effective immediately. His heart plummeted, a sudden, sharp panic gripping his chest. Why would she leave? Had he done something wrong? Had the boys pushed her too far? As he stood there, bewildered and holding the letter, his eyes fell upon the small side table. In her distressed haste to leave, Maya had forgotten her iPad. The device was sitting in sleep mode, but as Alexander accidentally brushed against the screen while reaching for the letter's envelope, the display flared to life. She hadn't locked the tablet. The screen illuminated the dark office, displaying her core design program, which was still open to her original, untampered master files for the brand campaign. Alexander stared at the glowing screen, completely paralyzed. He swiped past the lock screen, his breath hitching in his throat. He wasn't looking at the cold, angular, emotionless garbage his creative team had been producing for years. He was looking at a masterpiece. The designs on the screen possessed a vibrant, breathing soul. They told a story of warmth, resilience, and profound empathy. The exact qualities his company had abandoned, and the exact qualities Maya had brought back into his life. He swiped to the next image, and the next, completely stunned by the sheer, undeniable brilliance of the young woman he had hired to babysit his children. Wednesday morning arrived with a suffocating tension that settled over the top-floor glass conference room of Sterling Innovations like a lead weight. This was the pitch that would define the fiscal year. Sitting at the head of the massive, polished granite table was Eleanor Hughes, the formidable founder and CEO of the Bright Horizons Education Group. Eleanor was a woman in her early 60s who possessed the sharp, uncompromising elegance of a silver-haired hawk. Dressed in an immaculate, tailored navy suit adorned only by a simple pearl brooch, she had built her national childcare and education conglomerate from a single, struggling daycare center. Consequently, she possessed a razor-sharp, intuitive understanding of authentic family dynamics and an absolute chilling intolerance for corporate nonsense. Flanking her were her stern-faced executive board members. Opposite them sat Alexander Sterling, projecting his usual icy composure, though his pale blue eyes were tracking the unfolding disaster with microscopic precision. The disaster was currently standing at the front of the room, sweating profusely under the recessed LED lighting. Richard, the creative director, was 15 minutes into his presentation, and he was dying a slow, agonizing professional death. He clicked his laser pointer with trembling, clammy fingers, desperately trying to sell the stolen, bastardized version of Maya's concept. He had stripped away all the warmth, the fluid lines, and the deep, emotional resonance of her original work, replacing it with harsh, sterile geometric shapes bathed in cold industrial greys and aggressive neon accents. As you can see, we have optimized the visual paradigm to maximize market share. Richard droned, his voice tight and breathless, as he leaned heavily on empty corporate jargon. By leveraging a synergistic, multi-platform aesthetic, we project a 20% increase in user acquisition. The angular branding signifies robust structural integrity. Sitting near the wall, Chloe, his sycophantic junior assistant, furiously nodded along, though her heavy floral perfume could not mask the distinct scent of panic filling the room. Eleanor Hughes wasn't nodding. She was staring at the projection screen with a deepening, formidable frown. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and she was tapping her expensive fountain pen against the granite table, a rhythmic, sharp sound that echoed like a ticking time bomb. "Mr. Richard," Eleanor interrupted, her voice polite but cutting through the air like a blade. "My company builds safe havens for children. We nurture families." This branding looks like the logo for a high-security data server. It is entirely devoid of a pulse. Where is the connection? Where is the heartbeat? Richard blanched, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He stammered, frantically trying to pivot back to his metrics and analytics, but the room had already grown agonizingly cold. The contract was slipping away second by second. Alexander Sterling watched the catastrophic failure with profound clarity. He wasn't thinking about the millions of dollars on the line. He was thinking about the accidental art studio in his office. He remembered the previous Friday night, standing alone in the dark, holding Maya's crumpled resignation letter in one hand and staring at her brilliantly warm, original designs on her forgotten iPad with the other. He had summoned her to his office first thing Monday morning, flatly refusing to accept her resignation, though he hadn't yet confronted Richard, waiting for the perfect moment to let the thief hang himself with his own rope. Alexander slowly shifted his gaze toward the back of the conference room. Standing quietly in the shadows by the heavy oak doors, wearing her frayed olive-green blazer, was Maya. Richard, in a final act of petty humiliation, had ordered the intern to manage the coffee cart for the executives. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, watching her mangled ideas die on the screen. Alexander placed his hands flat on the granite table and stood up. The sudden movement instantly silenced Richard's panicked rambling. The towering CEO ignored his creative director entirely. He looked straight over the heads of the baffled executives, his piercing blue eyes locking directly onto the young black woman in the corner. "Maya," Alexander's voice resonated through the massive room, a low, steady baritone filled with absolute, unshakable trust. "Did you bring your iPad?" Every single head in the room whipped around to stare at the coffee cart. Maya froze, her dark eyes widening in sheer disbelief. She looked at Alexander, searching his face, and found no trace of the cold, demanding boss she had met weeks ago. She saw the man who had sat cross-legged on a carpet and drawn a terrible, rigid tree. She saw a father who had learned to let the ink spill. Maya took a deep, shuddering breath, her hands dropping to her sides. She reached into the worn canvas bag resting on the lower shelf of the cart and pulled out her battered tablet. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice shaking only slightly before settling into a rich, firm cadence. "I have it." Alexander gestured toward the podium with a decisive nod. "Bring it up here. Show them the real campaign." Richard's face flushed a violent, apoplectic purple. "Alexander, what is this? She's an intern. She fetches coffee," Richard hissed, stepping forward. "Sit down, Richard, before I have security remove you," Alexander replied, his voice dropping to a terrifying, lethal whisper that instantly froze the creative director in his tracks. The room was deathly silent as Maya walked down the long aisle. She didn't look at Richard as she stepped up to the podium. She connected the cable to her tablet. The massive screen flickered, and Richard's cold, geometric nightmare vanished. In its place, the room was suddenly bathed in a warm, radiant, golden light. Maya's original design blossomed across the screen. It was breathtaking. The logo wasn't a sharp, aggressive symbol. It was a fluid, sweeping embrace utilizing deep, comforting hues of sunset orange, moss green, and warm terracotta. It felt alive, moving with the same chaotic, beautiful energy of two toddlers painting a storm cloud. Maya looked out at the room, her eyes briefly meeting Eleanor Hughes's intense gaze. Maya didn't read from a script. She didn't use words like optimization, synergy, or market share. She spoke from her soul. A brand that serves families cannot be built on rigid architecture, Maya began, her voice warm, commanding, and deeply resonant. Because family isn't perfect. Family is messy. It's spilled paint on a living room rug. It's the chaos of a morning routine. It is loud, and it is unpredictable. She clicked to the next slide, showing the interconnected narrative structure of the brand identity, inspired directly by the lost tiger pups. We don't want to tell parents that we offer a sterile, flawless environment. We want to tell them that we see them. We understand the beautiful, exhausting reality of raising children. This brand identity is built on the touchpoints of profound empathy, tolerance, and absolute love. It tells a story not of corporate dominance, but of human presence. Because at the end of the day, when the noise fades, that is what every parent and every child is looking for, a safe place to be seen. Maya clicked the remote one final time. The screen faded to a soft, warm white, leaving the powerful logo lingering in the minds of everyone present. Then the screen went completely dark. The conference room was submerged in a stunned, profound silence. For 10 agonizingly long seconds, absolutely no one moved. Maya stood at the podium, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, terrified that she had just ruined her career and Alexander's company in one fell swoop. Then a sound cut through the quiet. It was the sharp, rhythmic sound of clapping. Eleanor Hughes pushed her chair back and stood up. A genuine, radiant smile had completely transformed her formidable face. She continued to applaud, slow and steady. Within seconds, her executive board joined her. Then Julian, the VP of Finance, started clapping, followed by the rest of the Sterling Innovations team. The room erupted into thunderous, resounding applause. Eleanor looked across the table at Alexander, offering a deep, respectful nod of approval. The contract was saved, not by sharp angles or market analytics, but by the quiet, undeniable power of a story told from the heart. It took exactly 30 days for the seismic shockwave of the Bright Horizons pitch to completely reshape the hierarchy of Sterling Innovations. Richard's departure was not a quiet, dignified exit. It was a swift, surgical removal orchestrated by Patricia Vance, the formidable head of human resources. Patricia was a woman in her late 50s who possessed the unnerving, terrifying ability to terminate an executive's contract while maintaining a perfectly serene, grandmotherly smile. With her silver hair cut into a sharp, uncompromising bob, and her reading glasses hanging from a delicate gold chain around her neck, she had overseen Richard's unceremonious packing of his desk with a gaze of polite, unyielding steel. He was forced out, his toxic legacy immediately dismantled. In his wake, the corporate structure did the unthinkable. Maya Washington, the 23-year-old intern who had previously been relegated to fetching iced Americanos and suffering daily humiliation, bypassed a decade of middle management hierarchy. She was formally appointed as the lead creative strategist. Her new office, located on the coveted second highest floor, was a breathtaking departure from the dark, windowless cubicle of her past. It was a sprawling, glass-walled sanctuary bathed in natural light, overlooking the vast, shimmering expanse of Lake Michigan. Maya had decorated the sleek space with vibrant potted plants, a massive corkboard overflowing with colourful sketches, and, framed proudly on the wall, the original wrinkled crayon drawing of the two lost tiger pups that had started it all. While Maya's professional life had transformed into a brilliant new reality, the most profound metamorphosis had occurred within Alexander Sterling himself. The ruthless, untouchable CEO who used to carry briefcases full of stress back to his empty penthouse every night simply ceased to exist. Alexander had finally learned the terrifying, beautiful art of being completely present. He instituted a strict, unbreakable personal rule: no corporate emails, no budget spreadsheets, and no teleconferences after 6 o'clock in the evening. His impeccably tailored monochromatic suits were increasingly replaced by soft, comfortable cotton sweaters and faded denim jeans. On a typical evening, instead of brooding over market shares with a glass of scotch, Alexander could be found sitting cross-legged on the floor of his living room. He had installed a permanent art station in his home, mirroring the accidental studio Maya had created in his office. He spent hours actively listening to Leo and Lucas's disjointed, imaginative stories, letting the boys freely smear non-toxic paint all over his expensive clothing without a single flinch or reprimand. He realized that true discipline wasn't about controlling his children's environment to absolute perfection. It was about holding space for their messy, chaotic development. The icy fortress he had built around his grieving heart had thawed entirely, replaced by the warm, chaotic, and vibrant joy of active fatherhood. Late on a breezy Friday afternoon, the golden hour sunlight slanted heavily through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Maya's new office, casting long, warm shadows across the polished hardwood floor. Maya was leaning over her drafting table, humming softly as she refined the final touches on a new digital campaign. A soft, familiar knock echoed against the glass door before it clicked open. Standing in the doorway was Alexander. He looked entirely different from the stressed, rigid man Maya had met a month ago. He had discarded his suit jacket, his tie was completely gone, and the top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt were casually undone. In his hands he held 2 large plastic cups of iced Americano, the dark liquid swirling with perfectly measured ratios of espresso and ice, exactly the way he knew she liked it. But he wasn't alone. Peeking out from behind his long legs were Leo and Lucas. The 3-year-old twins were clutching a massive, rolled-up sheet of thick butcher paper as if it were a highly classified treasure. Upon spotting Maya, the boys completely abandoned their father, rushing into the office with gleeful, high-pitched shrieks and launching themselves onto her brand-new, plush, mustard-yellow sofa. "Maya! Maya! Look what we made!" Leo yelled, excitedly unrolling the massive paper across the soft cushions. Lucas immediately jumped in, pointing a small, paint-stained finger at the center of the paper. "It's a picture of the loud noise." It was a sprawling, chaotic, abstract masterpiece. There were no discernible shapes, no straight lines, and absolutely no geometric logic. It was an explosion of brilliant crimson, deep azure, and bright sunshine yellow, all swirled together in a massive, messy, textured collision of color. It was completely undefined, yet it radiated an overwhelming, undeniable warmth. Maya smiled, her heart swelling as she traced the air above the painting, praising their brilliant use of color. Alexander walked over slowly, his footsteps quiet on the floorboards, and handed Maya her iced coffee. As she took the cup, her long fingers briefly, softly brushed against his. The touch was fleeting, light as a feather, but it sent a sudden electric warmth sparking through the quiet air between them. Maya looked up. Alexander was looking down at her, and his face broke into a smile. It wasn't his usual guarded, polite smirk. It was a genuine, deeply tender, and remarkably peaceful smile that reached all the way to his pale blue eyes. "The boys have been relentlessly insisting that we visit the wildlife sanctuary this weekend," Alexander said, his voice a low, warm rumble that completely filled the sunlit room. He paused, his gaze never leaving hers, carrying a soft, unspoken weight. "I was wondering if the lead creative strategist of Sterling Innovations might want to come along. To gather some reference material, of course." Maya held his gaze, the bustling noise of the city outside, fading into a quiet, distant hum. She looked at Alexander, seeing the profound vulnerability and hope he was offering. And then she glanced over at Leo and Lucas, who were now happily tumbling over each other on the sofa, completely at ease and filled with joy. She took a slow sip of her iced Americano, a bright, playful, and deeply affectionate spark dancing in her dark eyes. "I suppose I could make time," Maya replied, her lips curving into a vibrant, teasing smile. "But only if you promise to finally draw a proper tree, Alexander." Alexander let out a rich, genuine laugh, the sound mingling perfectly with the giggles of his sons and the low whistle of the Chicago wind pressing against the glass. The story closed in that resonant, echoing laughter of a windy afternoon. There were no grand, dramatic declarations of eternal love. There was no desperate, fated embrace or rushed, cinematic romance. They were simply standing together before a vast, blank, and completely open canvas. A deep, profound mutual respect, a quiet, abiding gratitude, and the subtle, fragile tremors of a new beginning were slowly, beautifully weaving themselves together. What colors they would choose to paint with tomorrow, what shape their story would ultimately take, belonged entirely to them. But whatever it became, it was absolutely certain that the canvas would be filled from edge to edge with the vibrant, beautiful colors of pure, unyielding presence and love. As we close this chapter, the lesson here is wonderfully simple yet profound. True success is not about managing every detail of our lives or chasing absolute perfection. It is about presence. It is about having the courage to step out of our rigid routines, sit on the floor, and let the colors spill outside the lines. In our everyday hustle, we often get so caught up in our schedules, our careers, and our endless to-do lists that we forget what truly matters. The people who love us do not need us to be flawless, they just need us to be there. They need our time, our attention, and our willingness to listen. Thank you for spending your time with us here at Tale and Tale. If this story brought a little warmth to your day, please share it with someone who might need a gentle reminder to slow down and embrace the beautiful mess of life. We would love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below, and please subscribe to the channel for more stories that touch the heart. May God bless you and your loved ones with endless peace, patience, and joy. If you believe in the healing power of love and presence, please type Amen in the comments. We will see you in the next story.